Hello, this is Jeff Kraft or Kali Das, and I'm making this video for you today because one of the students in my community recently asked me a question, and I thought it would be interesting to share it with everybody. So the question was this. She asked, why is it that so many people think that Tantra is about sex? So I'm going to offer you a few perspectives on that today, and I'm going to sort of start with the most mainstream kind of perspective, and going to present to you as the final part of it, kind of what the deeper perspective, the deeper teachings that Tantra really offers are. So why do so many people think that Tantra is about sex? Well, if you do a Google search about Tantra, you will find a lot of things about sex. And I would say that in a real practical kind of sense, just because our culture operates that way, Google is sort of its own version of God in a lot of ways, and when it comes to finding information. So the popularization of Tantra as a sexual yoga or as, a way of increasing sexual pleasure, increasing stamina, all of those types of things, they arise out of a couple of different parts of Tantra. So the reality is when we look at Tantra as a yogic practice, which is what it really originally is and still is, as a full system of yoga, an approach to self-improvement and an approach to kind of awakening to our own true and authentic self, that there are actually a very small number of practices in the tantric traditions that describe sexual activity in a ritualistic way that is designed to help unfold the inner experiences of reaching that higher potential of self or higher level of spiritual consciousness, we could say. Okay? So that was the original function of those sexual practices. So it is sort of not too hard of a leap to understand how knowing that those sexual practices existed might cause someone to sort of see just that part of it and think, oh, Tantra's about sex. That same sort of path, which is referred to the left-handed path, also has some other practices in it that, in more extreme versions, this is not necessarily something that would be practiced by everybody, but more extreme versions that also deal with other forms of our earthly experience, such as, doing worship in graveyards with dead bodies and things like that. Now, those are not so popular because the next part of the point here is that there is a saying in marketing that sex sells. And it's very true. It really taps into a very universal set of desires that we all have, which is to experience pleasure and happiness and joy. And sexuality and sexual experience, hopefully for most of us, becomes one of the vehicles that we're able to enjoy our body and enjoy pleasure and enjoy connecting with other people. It's one of the forms of happiness that we can have. And Tantra does teach, as part of a balanced life, that it is perfectly acceptable and encouraged for us to pursue pleasure and happiness as part of our experience, and that it could actually help us grow on a spiritual path. There are other parts of that I've mentioned before in previous blog posts that are sort of the 4 goals of life. So there's the pleasure aspect that I just mentioned. There's also teaching that a part of the goal of life is, or one of the goals of life is, having material success, material wealth to be able to support yourself. Having a sense of purpose or dharma is also one of them. And then the pursuit of a deeper spiritual nature or moksha or liberation is the 4th of those. So those are the 4 goals that Tantra honors as being part of a legitimate set of things that we could and should pursue as part of finding a balanced, happy, whole life. So back to sex sells. Sex sells. And so it is easy to understand how taking those small number of practices and kind of moving them into and blending them into other practices from the Taoist erotic traditions, and kind of connecting them and linking them into our more human experiences of pleasure and intimacy, and the legitimate capacity to be able to develop more pleasure and more stamina and more connection in those relationships, that it serves two different purposes, because it is one of the goals, one of the legitimate goals that Tantra acknowledges. It also connects to the original sexual practices in a certain way, even though the starting point isn't necessarily the exact same intention for why they were presented originally. It does invite the possibility of evolving beyond just the sort of more human version of pleasure, and really using the practices to evolve spiritually as an individual if you're single, or as a couple if you happen to be in a relationship. So that becomes part of it. But there's also a deeper layer to this that I want to talk about, which is that what Tantra is ultimately inviting us to do is to really explore our relationship and our capacity for happiness on a certain level. How do we engage life? How do we kind of tap into this sort of creative flow of the unfolding of the universe when you start looking at the more sacred part of it? So at a deeper level, the sacred sexuality part actually becomes a metaphor for how the process of creation unfolds, how we experience our lives. And we're taught within Tantra that there are these energies that are kind of moving through us that are allowing the universe to unfold, allowing the energies in our lives to unfold. So when we start looking at sacred sexuality as a metaphor for our lives, if it's not just about the sexual union with a partner, but we can start to take the metaphors, for instance, of where are the places in us that have a desire that arises, a desire that wants to be met. In sexual union, of course, that desire becomes a sexual component that wants to kind of seek union with another person to enjoy and explore and savor the desire and the pleasure that arises out of it. But what about the desires that you have for creativity, for getting a new job, for raising your children if you have children, for traveling, for writing a book, for writing a song, for singing, all of those types of things, anything that you can think of, there is a deeper potential desire that could be there for you. And of course, not everybody has every desire under the sun. So we wouldn't necessarily expect that everyone listening to this is going to desire to be on stage and be a performer, for instance. But if that is part of your own makeup, then learning to honor that desire, honor that expression of creativity and happiness, and allow it to manifest itself in the same way that you would honor, maybe a sexual desire in a healthy context. So allowing that creativity, that desire to arise, and then merging with the experience in a way that brings about greater happiness, greater freedom, greater connection to life. So with that metaphor in mind, the sacred sexual union is really merging with life itself. So instead of the male merging with the female in a more literal sense, it is our inner desire to create, to sort of plant the seeds of our own creative genius out into the world, to cultivate, to nurture them, and to birth the forms of pleasure, the forms of creation that are wanting to move through us as we move in the world. And that process is kind of birthing our own creative genius in the world. So instead of a literal child, we are birthing these sort of creative children, these thought forms, these forms of art, these forms of expression, these forms of joy and passion. Maybe it's even something as simple as just being really passionate about a sports team, for instance. But allowing ourselves to kind of connect and honor the different desires that move through us, and move that and express it out into the world as part of experiencing our own deeper fulfillment and our own connection to life, to ourselves. And ultimately, Tantra teaches us that this entire experience is actually all happening within the sacred consciousness of the divine or of God. And so we're actually using that energy as a way of tapping in to the flow of creation, tapping into the universal flow. And through that process, we become more free, more joyful, more abundant, and more connected, more peaceful. And we may also, of course, benefit our literal sexual lives, but we start to feel that flow and that desire and that passion moving through us more and more, even in daily life. And that's become sort of the deeper teaching of what it is that we're really wanting to accomplish through Tantra. To be able to honor all of the desires that we have and to allow ourselves the freedom to really express what's moving through us, to merge with the world, to penetrate into the experience of life and really allow ourselves to enjoy the culmination of whatever it is that's arising for us. And of course, there are lots of different teachings and parameters around how to best do that process in order for us to take the experiences of life and actually use them as a way of evolving ourselves spiritually through the process of Tantra Yoga. So that is the reason that Tantra is so often associated with sexuality and sex. And so you have sort of the worldly version of it, which has a lot of benefits actually. And you also have the larger picture of where it's really inviting us in a deeper sense to grow and to find deeper happiness and deeper connection to ourselves and to life, and ultimately this sort of idea of pure consciousness, which is ourself or equal to that divine presence. So hope you have enjoyed this, and I'll see you soon. Namaste.